Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. My name is John Braden, and we are a progressive on-air dialogue on culture, politics, and the critical issues of our time. And we have the great pleasure today to be broadcasting from the home of Beatty Cohan and Jim Vrettos in the liberal Upper West Side of Manhattan on Riverside Drive. Now, Jim and I have known each other for a while through the NSP, Network of Spiritual Progressives, which is a spiritual political organization founded by Michael Lerner and Cornell West, and we recently reconnected because Jim has a radio show called The Rebbe, The Radical, and The Rev. Wonderful, wonderful show. And I appeared as a guest on his show with my book, The Ethical Sales Agent. We talked about integrating ethical values into corporate culture. And while I was on Jim's show, he said to me, you need to meet my wife. My wife is doing some kind of similar, type work, and she's very interested in creating a more, humane society, both inside and outside the business world. And so I was brought here to meet Beatty, and I discovered this amazing woman who is so bright and intelligent and articulate. She has an expertise. She's a nationally recognized psychotherapist. She speaks all over around the world. She's been on major national media, Fox News, CNN. She's been on Geraldo many times, and she writes. She wrote a book about marriage and how to improve, relationships. So I think it's just an incredible couple. This amazing, creative, intelligent couple that are both involved in projects in the world to make the world a better place. And I wanted to bring this to our audience. And meanwhile, when we started our dialogue, we began thinking about bringing back the old-fashioned salons and to sort of get people in a room and connecting and communicating about art and culture and political issues, but just really get people talking again, face-to-face like they used to in the old days. And, Gertrude Stein had the salon, but salons go back to ancient Egypt, and there was one in Greenwich Village, with Mabel Dodge back in the early 20th century. So we're here. I want to introduce these lovely couple to you. I want them to each talk about themselves and their projects. We have no script for this. This is open dialogue, so you don't know where it's going to go in different directions, and that's the fun of it. That's what's so beautiful about it. But we're here in their lovely apartment, and we're going to start with Beatty, and she's going to introduce herself and talk a little bit about her work. And so, Beatty, welcome to the Public Voice Salon.
Well, it's really great to be here, and what a lovely, warm introduction. Thank you for that. Well, as you said, I am a nationally recognized psychotherapist and sex therapist.
Oh my goodness.
Not as exciting as a lot of people.
Put the kids to bed, folks.
Right. Not as exciting as a lot of people may believe about really what goes on in the world of sex therapy. I am also the co-author of For Better, For Worse, Forever: Discover the Path to Lasting Love, and I'm very, very proud of the book. The book actually was written for my daughter, and the book is about how to assess who's right for you and who's wrong for you before you commit, before you say, I do. Because really, one of the things that I've discovered over the past 35 years that I've been practicing as a psychotherapist and a sex therapist is that we're not really doing all that well in the world of relationships. And I've actually discovered really 4 reasons why we're not doing well. And of course, the ideal is not to just focus on the problems, but to also come up with, with positive solutions. And what I have found is that unless, we are all in a good place, emotionally and psychologically and psychiatrically, we're not able to have a good relationship with anybody. So we really have to be okay first for ourselves. And then number 2, unfortunately, but the reality is that the majority of people have simply not learned what ingredients go into a long-term successful relationship. And if you were not really fortunate enough to see a positive functional relationship when you were growing up in your own family, you're kind of left to your own devices. And if you look at the portrayals on television, the negative portrayals and the dysfunctional portrayals about relationships, it's like, what do you really learn about it? And number three, if you don't know what ingredients, really go into a healthy relationship, you're in no position to be able to assess who's right for you and who's wrong for you. And of course, that's what the book is about. And about my background, well, I am Canadian. Of course, I have dual citizenship, and so I am Canadian and American. But of course, the Canadian part of me, the gentler, kinder part, and it's so interesting when you talk about politics. I mean, we in Canada, we don't worry about health insurance, and we don't really talk about bullying in the schools. And as you probably know, I mean, for women who are pregnant and who have children, you have a year's maternity leave, paid maternity leave. So it's in many, many ways, it's a much easier, it's a much kinder, it's a much more gentle lifestyle. And I have a master's degree in clinical social work from McGill University in Montreal. And I have postgraduate specialization in marriage and family therapy and sexual dysfunction. And I have a private practice here in beautiful New York City, where I treat actually men and women of all ages and stages in life whose problems range from depression and anxiety and early child sexual abuse, addictions of every kind, and of course relationship and sexual issues. And that's really my passion. I mean, I love doing the psychotherapy. And when my book came out initially in 1999, and it came out in a third edition a couple of years ago, that was when the media world opened up to me. And I've been in the national media, radio, and television now for over 25 years. So that's a little bit about my background, and I'm really happy to be here dialoguing with you and, of course, with my husband, Jim. It's great.
We feel so lucky to have you on our show here, Beatty. I think it's interesting, for Jim's perspective, he's very lucky because, he doesn't need to go to a psychotherapist. If he needs a psychotherapist, if he needs a sex therapist, it's, all in one package. He has a wife that has all of these things. It's interesting, also that Jim gets into issues of political issues involved with also relationships, or how that connection between the larger society and how happy people are. And just thinking you're right about, like, people make the wrong choices in terms of they marry the first person that comes along, or people go to these nightclubs where it's loud and you can't hear people talk, and they have drinks, and the first person that comes along, they wind up getting married. But you also talk about how relationship education should be ongoing in the public space. I want to turn it over to Jim, because Jim, your radio show, the Rebbe, the Radical, and the Rev, I think is a very educative program. And when you listen to it, there's a humanity to it. You have guests on there who are very strong in their critical intelligence. People like Stanley Aronowitz have been on your show. Carl Dix recently was on the show. Glenn Ford of the Black Agenda. You bring these voices, and you have these wonderful. So there's a sort of a similarity between the two of you in the work you're doing. It's very therapeutic in different ways. But Jim, I want to hand the microphone over to you, and you can introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, John, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Beatty, for being my everything. I will not. Let's leave it at that. And she definitely is, and she brings in her own work, her professional work, a kinder, gentler approach to life that also translates into just the happiest, most wonderful relationship possible. I feel so blessed and happy to have met her and be involved with her. And makes my life so much better. And as you mentioned, John, we met several years ago, connecting with Rabbi Michael Lerner and his organization, and I've known Michael for, gosh, probably close to 30 years now. And I'm a sociologist, I'm a criminologist, John Jay College. And as you say, I have a radio show on Progressive Radio Network, Monday evenings at 8 o'clock. And as you are, Beatty, we're concerned with trying to build a more political and spiritually progressive world through relationships, through transformation of the economic, the political, the moral, spiritual scene, if you will. And in the course of that, I've been very, very lucky to have an incredible array of guests: Noam Chomsky and Fran Piven, Stanley Aronowitz, members of the Central Park Five, King Tone of the Latin Kings, and this coming Monday, tomorrow, actually, we're going to have David Rothenberg, who is the founder of the Fortune Society, the national leading organization attempting to heal and work with ex-offenders. And I've been doing some research on him, and one of the first things he mentions in his own biography is the need to have relationship training and education and help these largely men, women also, who come out of prisons. They're lost. They need that restructuring again. They need to establish the family ties. They need to pick up where they can in establishing these all-important relationships. So I'm in the field of criminal justice. I've been involved in social movements my entire adult life, civil rights, anti-war movements, and so on. And this radio show is an attempt to bring together a wide array of people from all kinds of progressive backgrounds to have a dialogue on building and healing the world. And of course, this is what you've been trying to do, John, in a magnificent way. And I hope that this show can be expanded to this salon, as you said before, to have a lot of other people become involved. I think it's so important for people to hook up and connect with each other on a much more human level, face to face, and talk about how we can transform this world. And so, again, thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled. And let me turn it back to you, John.
Thank you, Jim. And again, just to let the people know, we're having a dialogue here. This is unscripted. This is open. Dialogue is also a process of discovery, where through the talk and through the conversation, you learn new ideas. Very interested in dialogue as a professor of English now at Essex County College in Newark, but actually next year will be the 20th anniversary of my teaching career, which began in Hoboken as a substitute teacher back in the mid-1990s, and I would substitute teach. I would go into a classroom where the regular teacher was absent, and what I would do is I never followed the book. I never followed the, because usually sometimes teachers would leave something or sometimes they wouldn't, but I always felt that, I always have been a critic of the education system, that there's an inhumanity to it. And as we can see now with all the standardized tests, it's become very mechanized and people are losing their souls in the school system. So I would go into a classroom and just kind of be with the students and let them approach me first and begin a dialogue. And I found that this method worked, that there were students, for example, a lot of students who would cut class when a substitute came. You'd hear them in the hallway, hey, yo, there's a sub, let's jet. And usually the tougher kids, they would take off. And this one particular room, I remember there was a window in the door. And usually about halfway through the class, and then my classes were usually okay. I didn't have the kind of discipline problems. Other teachers would say to me, how do you do it, Well, I try to, create that humanity in the classroom. And then halfway through the class, I'd look up and there'd be eyes at the door looking in. And it's those tough kids that took off. They wanted to come in now because they saw that these islands of humanity, these dialogues that were going on, and they would come in and they'd be part of this. They want to. So I think human beings need conversation. We need discourse. We need to be acknowledged and recognized. And I think in our society we're becoming more alienated, more atomized, and that's always been one of my concerns. And even now with the technology, which is good and bad, there's a lot of the people walking around with iPods. They almost seem very dehumanized, and sort of people looking away from each other. So we're trying to create, and I said, Jim, your radio show is like an oasis of humanity, just to hear your voice and the kindness and the caring, and you're so passionate about your guests, and you uplift people. And Beatty, your work also as a psychologist and psychotherapist. Psychotherapy is so important. When I talk to my students now at Essex County College, who are mostly poor, black, Latino, they're coming out of the inner city environment. Most of them don't even know about psychotherapy. So there's very little education about that in the social classes, in the lower social classes, and even now, even in the middle classes, we're losing that. It's become an elite thing for people who even know about psychotherapy. Is that true, or what do you think? Yeah.
I think it's true in the United States. Now, when I was living in Montreal, I finished my graduate and postgraduate work at McGill, and I started off in the inner city school system as a school social worker. Now, that was a few years ago. All of the schools had school social worker programs, and we didn't have hundreds of cases. We may have had 30 cases. We worked very, very closely with the teachers and principals and guidance counselors so that there was early intervention beginning at the kindergarten level. And then a couple of years after my first job as a school social worker, myself and two other women, we ran the entire school social services program for the English sector for the entire province of Quebec. Again, so that every school had a pupil personnel team, actually, that I put together with my colleagues on a very, very regular basis. There would be case conferences so that everybody knew that if there was a child who was either very withdrawn or was acting out, that there would be a referral to rule out were there learning disabilities, were there problems at home. And it was so basic, so that when I hear now about that there really isn't the kind of early intervention in the schools, and that school social service programs are either so remote or the social workers are just so overloaded, for me, it's like the Canadian system, it worked so well. And I also believe that it was very, very cost efficient, because we were able early on to identify the so-called problem child. I remember going to people's homes. They would serve me tea. We would do home visits on a regular basis so that there was really no child was left behind.
I think the schools are actually adding to the depression in our society, but I think they're part of a symptom, And what do you think, Jim? Do you think that when you look at the work of people like Harriet Fraud, who's been a guest on your show, is there something in our culture now that's making people sad? Are people, can we have a better world? For example, if we had a better economy and people had more free time to actually read and to think and to reflect on life and to develop friendships and even to go to psychotherapy, and if you had better health care and people had a sense of recognition. I mean, both of you are very creative people. Jim, you have a radio show. You're a wonderful educator, and Beatty, you're an author and a wonderful teacher and lecturer, and so you have a sense of self-esteem. But a lot of our guests who are watching, a lot of people watching, they don't feel that. Maybe they have a job that's just like routine, where they sort of drag themselves out of bed in the morning to go to sit in a cubicle for 10 hours and have no sense of meaning from that. Getting back to Michael Lerner and the this idea of ethics and meaning and having a meaningful life. What do you think some of the larger economic and political issues, Jim, that even are about creating a happier society? Yeah.
Well, you've asked the monumental question there, and of course, you've hit the nail on the head. I think we should also mention that those people who dragging themselves out of bed there or trying to get to work, who are so unhappy and acting dysfunctional, one of the things they could do is ask Beatty, and but they could call. And by the way, I don't know if we've mentioned, but she has a show on Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, Progressive Radio Network, called Ask Beatty. And so that's one way of I know, okay, but we want another plug. But it's a very, very worthy plug. But look, as you know, John Beatty, we've talked with somebody. We've had Rick Wolf on the show as well. Cornel West, of course. These progressive thinkers have pointed out, as we should all know, that something like 1/4 of all the children in this city alone are growing up in poverty. And so, but beyond the statistics, this means a sort of deprivation. This is a lack of nurturing. This is a sort of harshness, cruelty that we're putting our children through. There's in a sense a war on the underclass, the poor, particularly, as Cornell would say, children from the chocolate side of town, but those on the vanilla side too. But and one of the things that I've gotten involved in is involved in criminal justice is to protest the stop and frisk policies, which is an extension of this cruelty. So economically, we are making it very difficult for these young people to survive, literally. The educational system, as you say, is failing us. Well over half the students are not graduating from the New York City public high schools. The outlook for jobs for these young people are disastrous. They're in debt up to their eyebrows, in a sense. They're going to be, in a sense, dentured servants to paying off their loans. So you're right. People are not happy. People are looking at the world. They're looking at the political economic system, the criminal justice system, the family system. It doesn't seem to be working. It seems to be broken. And we're all looking for ideas as to how to transform it, how to make it more kind and gentler and healthier and so on. The economy, the environment, wars, violence, the list goes on and on. And I think we need to look at it from a variety of perspectives. I think we also have to humanize this, and that's what Beatty does so well. And you, John, as you bring that humanity that you're both trying to exhibit in your practices, in the one-to-one relationships, in the schools, in the classrooms. I think it has to certainly start there. And then we also need to apply enough political pressure on the system and come up with transformative movements that I think will push the system in a more progressive way. So that's for just starters for right now, yeah.
This is a wonderful dialogue unfolding here on Riverside Drive, and the liberal Upper West Side. This is the last bastion of liberalism, maybe, on the right here in this apartment. Yes, there's others out there, and even but Claudia and I recently saw the film about Hannah Arendt. She's a philosopher, and there was a time when and in fact, there was scenes that were shot on Riverside Drive, where you saw the Hudson River outside, which I'm looking out at the Hudson River right now. It looks so beautiful out there. And one
10 blocks north.
Hannah Arendt was 10 blocks north from here, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. Hannah Arendt, who was a critic of totalitarianism and her philosophy. Her philosophy is also very dialogical. She talked a lot about human relationships and expanding the dialogue. I noticed a lot of that. I'm very dialogical in nature. One of my heroes is Carl Rogers, who's a psychologist. And every semester, I always like to read an essay by Carl Rogers in my classroom about his approach, which is very non-directive, which is very open and allowing the classroom to sort of take shape on its own. And because of the way of that very low-key way of teaching, he sort of brings out the best in other people, and there's a kind of openness and flexibility that comes through this open dialogue. And very often when Carl Rogers was asked to teach a class somewhere, he wouldn't teach. He would just sit back, and people would sit in a circle, and it would just unfold naturally. So I bring this to my students who have no awareness of this at all, and then they're like, wow, this is, now we understand the way you teach, and having the authoritarian, kind of a method is very, very different. So psychology and psychotherapy, I think, are very interconnected into politics and into democracy, into expanding the discourse and the conversation in throughout our society. So I think we're beginning something here, and I want to hand it over to Beatty. Just what do you think? Do you think that? Do you sense a lot of the connection between the sadness that people feel and the economic system and the political system?
Well, I think that, first of all, we're all in agreement that there is a lot of disconnection. I mean, one of the things that Jim and we will observe, we'll be out for dinner, and you're looking at a couple, and they're both on their cell phones. Now, people talk about we are so connected out there, and what I'm finding is that we may be more actively, touching base with people around the world, but there seems to be so much more disconnect. I mean, I'm on the subways, and people are on their iPods and the games, and how many people and how many couples say to each other, you know what, we need to really make a date to talk. We need to make a date to listen. We need to make a date to have sex. I mean, I see couples in my private practice in their 30s and 40s who basically live in sexless relationships and sexless marriages because we're all running around, and we've really lost track of what the priorities really are. Now, when you talk about economics and relationships, I mean, one of the things that Jim and I have talked about a lot is that if one were to think about removing the barriers of racism and poverty and sexism, how would that translate into people having healthier relationships? Now, what I have found in the 35 years that I've been practicing as a psychotherapist and a sex therapist is that correlation is not necessarily true. In the last 25 years, I've had an opportunity to treat some of the wealthiest and, in quotes, most successful people in the United States, and who have not had money issues and were not waiting for the welfare checks to arrive, as my clients were in Montreal. And yet their relationship knowledge and relationship skill, there are no differences because people are not fortunate enough to be involved or be reaching out for relationship education. So removing the barriers in themselves does not translate into having healthier relationships and more successful relationships. It's simply not true.
There was a philosopher named Paulo Freire from Brazil. He wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he says that the oppressors, who are the elites, the 1%, he said, they are themselves oppressed. But he says they can only be liberated by, ironically, the oppressed are the only ones who can open them up and liberate them. So you're right, there's that sadness, there's that unhappiness, even in the business culture. One reason I created this organization called the Ethical Business Society is to reach people in the corporate culture. Get conversations going at the water cooler, where traditionally the left has shied away from the inner sanctums of corporate culture. Now Beatty has gotten involved. She has been on Fox News, which is, I think that's a wonderful, positive development, that we have someone of Beatty's consciousness who has been invited into the inner sanctum of even the Fox News. It was interesting to find out recently that Sean Hannity has been bumped to the 10 o'clock spot. He used to be on 9 o'clock. It was the first major change at Fox in over a decade, and Hannity represents more of a far-right agenda. So I think maybe there is a mellowing, maybe there is some hope we can get out of this. I saw also that recently Alec Baldwin has been given a show once a week, and Alec Baldwin is a very liberal guy. He's down in Greenwich Village now, and his politics have always been much more progressive. So maybe, do you think there are any signs of hope here, and how can we build on that here and what we're doing and what others watching us? How can we, because we look at the ecological crisis. We look, we were at the Left Forum this year, and Noam Chomsky spoke there, and Jill Stein, about how, and this is something Stanley Aronowitz says too, that we might not have a planet at the end of the century if we don't wake up. Everybody's got to wake up. Warren Buffett, and he seems to be more progressive, and even Ralph Nader wrote a book. He wrote a novel called "Only the Super Rich Can Save Us," where it's really it's an imaginary book about what would happen if one day, the wealthy, the Soroses, and the Buffetts, they all got together and said, hey, we have to pitch in because, our grandkids aren't going to have a world. So do you think that, is there a shift going on, Jim? Do you see?
Well, I sure hope so. I think it's not just going to happen by itself. I think people have to, as you say, have their consciousness raised and be more educated, and then also have a sense of moral suasion to go out there and courage to go out there and resist the system, to protest against it in every way, come up with alternatives. I think I can't. I agree totally with Beatty that relationships are absolutely central to any community in the history of culture and societies. We need each other. We're social animals to our core. We know that when we put people in solitary confinement in prisons, how that destroys our connection, and very soon we are brought to the level of mental dysfunction that's unbelievable. So whatever system, you're right, whatever system we may be under, relationship is still the key. Now, some systems can be more oppressive than others, but Marx certainly talked about relationships, the nature of family, marriage. Marx did. Well, he also thought that capitalism produced a slave system, in a sense. Monogamous relationships under capitalism was the first form of slavery. So, but he still, his attempts to liberate us from that scourge still does not answer the question I think that Beatty is asking, that you're asking. How do we relate to each other? And you were talking about the oppression that people experience, the sort of the master-slave relationship, and the need to connect to others, as you were saying, not through our iPods and whatever, digital devices, in a more humane way. And those who are oppressing and who are so rich and famous are not happy either. And they don't know what it means to really relate at this deeper human level. And as you pointed out, we can learn so much from those who we are, in a sense, oppressing, those who are in the economic, political positions, as King tried to show in the civil rights movement. How we need to understand the salvation, the attempts to bring about a more transformative world has to start with those, ironically, who are most suffering, who have been most exploited by it. And sometimes they also act out in a dysfunctional way, and we try to help them in that way. But those who are struggling to raise our consciousness need to be heard. And I think that's one of the political and economic steps that needs to happen. As Rick Wolff points out, democracy at work. We need to go back, not constantly focus on, well, what's Buffett going to do? What's Gates going to do? What are the political economic elites going to do? We have to listen to the people themselves, the workers, and what they're needing. And I think a good therapist does that too, don't they? I mean, you listen to what the person brings to the situation, and you need to bring their concepts into an analysis and in order to help them, right?
Well, absolutely true. But again, it really does all begin at the beginning. And just think, if we were to be able to have really wonderful, comprehensive mental health, social service programs in the educational system, we would be teaching kids. I mean, I remember when I was running the school social services program in Montreal, I would bring in Marlo Thomas's records, and we would be talking about, I remember the record. In those days, you see, we still had records, Free to Be You and Me, and having small group discussions with the little kids, teaching them What do you say if you're upset? How do you express anger well? I mean, people don't know how to do any of these things, again, because it goes back to we haven't learned. So it would be so helpful for all of us, politically and economically, if we really began, you're an educator, and of course you are as well, in the schools to teach the kids the ABCs of healthy relationships, healthy communication, healthy problem solving. I mean, we're really cast out there. We don't have the tools. We don't have the emotional, the psychological tools to really be able to make it in this world. It's a little scary. So for me, it's about what do we need to do? What do we need to do? I was living in Florida for 10 years, and Governor Jeb Bush actually appointed me to the Florida State Commission on Marriage. And, well...
One good thing. They did one good thing. Okay.
It was interesting, and what he actually wanted was for me to be able to implement my relationship education programs in the high schools and in the colleges throughout the entire state of Florida. And I was very surprised because he is Republican and I'm not, and I think he had seen me on ABC television, and his daughter was going through some real difficulties at the time, and he reached out to me, and it was so interesting. I checked in with my answering service one day, and there was a message from Jeb Bush. But the frustrating experience of my having been a commissioner for 2 years is that I was able to deal with all the higher-ups in education and mental health and social services throughout the state of Florida. And even with his initial support, what I found was that people didn't get it and they really didn't care. And I had a very frustrating 2-year appointment as a commissioner because the educational higher-ups, they were really not interested in incorporating relationship education programs into the schools or into the colleges in the state of Florida. But I'm continuing here in New York. And hopefully, through dialogue like this, we'll be able to have some real impact, because I know that it all begins at the beginning.
Thank you for that, Beatty. I'm gonna make a confession now. That I used to be very shy when I was younger, very, very shy. I had a very difficult time talking to people and having conversations, even in college, when I started college. One of the experiences that changed my life was attending NYU's School of Education, where I learned a lot of theories on communication, and we did a lot of small group work. And I began to realize that I had a voice, that I had things to say. And all of a sudden, from that time on, I've had depressions in the past. That's another confession I'll make here. Maybe sitting next to a therapist, but I feel the trust. I feel the trust here, But since I became a teacher at the age of 31, and from that moment on, mentally, I've been much more well-adjusted. I've been actually very, very happy because I have a mission in life. You see, I feel like I'm helping others to grow and find their voices, and that comes back to me. But it took a while. But it took learning ideas. For example, the program at NYU, which in the mid-'90s when I attended, was very progressive and very cutting edge, and it was very social justice oriented, and it was very empowering to find your voice. It was all about, you become an English teacher, so you help others to find their voices. Teaching writing is about helping people find their voices on paper, but it's also about finding your voice in the classroom and outside the classroom. And when I began to find my voice in the classroom, in those classrooms at NYU, I began to then find my voice outside the classroom, and my life changed from then.
Let me just say something. What you've just said is really important. You wanted to find your voice, okay? And that is the difference between people who find their voice and don't. And I talk about all the time about the importance of people really wanting to acknowledge and address and resolve issues. It's very easy for all of us to spend our time and our lives complaining and bemoaning and what we don't have and what we would like to have. And I also was somebody who was really, really shy. I never could have done this, ever could have done this 35 or 40 years ago. And I remember my first day at McGill in my graduate program, I could hardly even say my name. I was that inhibited. I really was. And for me, believe it or not,
Former shy people break out.
yes, it's true. Because we wanted to, and the thing that really made a difference for me is that I wanted to be able to feel confident and get up and be able to give talks, and I took the Dale Carnegie course, and that changed my life. It changed my entire professional career. And even now, I'll be sitting on a television set or doing, a radio show, and I think of little Beatty, from years ago, who really was not able to do this, but it was about motivation, and it was about follow through, and it was about taking care of business, so that if people have emotional issues, psychological issues, work issues, problems in their marriage or family problems, people need to want to do something about it. And hopefully a show like this is also very motivational for people to get excited, to get involved politically, to get involved in actually addressing and resolving whatever the problems are that we are all facing, and we all have issues. Even therapists have issues, of course.
Well, I have to join the confessional here. I was shy too. What can I tell you? So that makes it three of them. And but I think you're absolutely right. You have to want it. You have to be ready for it. You have to come to the point of your life where you want to change. And I think also, if you think about it politically, economically, morally, spiritually, environmentally, a larger culture has to be ready as well. And I think we are. A lot of individuals aren't ready yet. They feel that something's wrong. They're complaining. They're unhappy. They're lashing out in ways that are dysfunctional for the society, for them. So we're a very confused, troubled culture at all kinds of levels. But I think we're on to something here, and I look forward so much to extend this dialogue to others in this salon and have others join us, because I think through that communication, small groups and larger groups, we can build something that's really much healthier and more long-standing, so I'm just very glad we're doing all of this. But again, I join the confessional here. Not Catholic, but I'm actually baptized Greek Orthodox. I don't know if they have confessionals, but we've got to all change.
Well, and we welcome our audience also to be part of this confessional, to be part of this dialogue. I mean, here we are in this beautiful apartment that's very culturally rich. There's wonderful paintings on the wall. I feel an artistry here. I feel a love for art. And I think art and culture also has a lot to do with this, with growth and transformation and learning, and even philosophy and ideas. And, I'm a critic of the way our education system, and I got this from Stanley Aronowitz, who was a guest on your show, in his book about education. He wrote a book called The Knowledge Factory, where colleges are now moving away from sociology and moving away from philosophy and the humanities, and they're pushing a business major model on people. And that, I think, leads to very a lack of conversation also, because how can you think if you don't have these concepts, if you don't have, to read Socrates, to read the Greeks and Plato, and to read great literature like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, it's life-changing. And so people's reading habits, but people, so I think there's an educational component to all of this. And yet when you have a salon, when you have an open dialogue, you could bring writers in. You can get people excited about books, about learning, and that after the dialogue, it sends you back to, the library or to the bookstore, that you want to continue adding to your knowledge about ideas and about culture and about art. So I'm feeling that spirit here. I'm feeling this gestalt of culture, of art, just looking around the room, and also, cinema and films is important. I'm a big fan of the French New Wave, and even thinking about now for some reason, Eric Romer was a filmmaker who his films are very rich with conversation and relationship dialogue. Claire's Knee is one of my favorite movies. I've actually shown that to my students who have had no exposure to any of this cinema or culture because our education systems are denuded. They are they're stripped of this rich culture and discourse. So, you know, if we have to fix the schools, yes, but before we can start at home. We could start with these dialogues. We can start in communities. We could start in cafes, turning to strangers and getting discussions going in cafes. So it's creating alternative public spaces for this kind of dialogue and discourse, and I feel like we're beginning that here. And it's so wonderful to have someone, Beatty, of your psychoanalytic depth help guide us with this, and Jim also with your spiritual and political background in academia. I'm very lucky to be here right now.
Well, and I feel very lucky to be a part of this conversation as well. And, you know, recently I've been reading in the newspaper and, you know, hearing in the media that, you know, colleges are becoming and degrees are becoming much more online. So people on a day-to-day basis, they don't even have the opportunity to dialogue with anybody because they're on their computer and they're taking their tests. And I think that we're really losing out a lot. I mean, perhaps the tuitions are going to be diminished. And I was reading somewhere that in Florida, there's going to be a $10,000 a year tuition, but we're paying a price for that because there's no intimacy. There's no human contact. So we're going to get our degrees in isolation.
I want to just also mention that my wife, Claudia, who's filming us now, she's the love of my life, and she really has brought wonderful, sense of humanity to me. Claudia's from South America. She's from Colombia. She's indigenous background in her culture, and I think also, you know, there is a certain critique from the South to the North also, looking at what's happening. One thing I learned recently, that liberation theology, which was very strong in Latin America and was put down by the last pope who stepped down, that I just found this out at the latest NSP meeting, that the new mayor of New York, or probably will be, Bill de Blasio, he likes liberation theology. I was like so shocked to hear that. So, you know, Claudia, she brought me to South America. I was the first time, and talk about transformative. And it's a very different culture. There's a sense of family. There's a sense of people accept each other more for who they are. And I don't feel that hyper competitiveness that you get in America, even within families, that it's like who's on top, who's smarter, who's this, who's that. When Claudia calls her family, she calls her family very frequently, and she talks in Spanish. I don't understand what she's saying, but there's a warmth that fills the room just from the dialogue, and there's a sense of love that you get. So I think even in America, we have a lot to learn from other cultures.
Well, there was a recent study done. Actually, it was a Harvard study, and 200 men were followed for 75 years. And that in itself is really amazing, to be able to have a research study where people were willing to participate and be followed for 75 years. And the big question was, what is actually the most important thing that people, specifically these men, really wanted from their lives? Well, it wasn't money, and it wasn't power, and it wasn't the big penthouse in a 20-room apartment in Manhattan, but it was love. And that was the consistent finding. And in the final analysis, as we know, that's really what it's all about.
You know, I can't agree more. And I think we were on that track to a certain extent back in the 60s. Make love, not war. There was a counterculture which looked to establish relationships not based on the bottom line of money, competitiveness, but caring and nurturing. And again, it is love and connecting, and it's reflected in the economic system, the political system, and the way people are relating in their most intimate relationships, which aren't, as you know, aren't working. But the divorce rate is over half. The majority of people are not getting what you're saying we all want. And I do definitely agree with you that it's a matter of education. That's a start. That's what is absolutely missing. I know my students at John Jay, they're craving an understanding of relationships. They don't know what to make of what's happening these days, and they're not anywhere in a sense, really in understanding this. So we're really failing them, and our schools are failing them. The family structure is failing them, and I do think that we're really onto something here with this educational programs that we need to have.
And also, I think as much as communication is also very, very important, obviously, silence, I think, also has a place. Soulful silences, there's a spiritual aspect of that, sort of bringing a little monasticism into the world, into the life. Sometimes we can be too talky of a culture. I'm becoming aware of that. We're constantly in the media being talked at constantly, and so what is nourishing talk? What is the place of silence as well? And also learning just some structural things about conversation and dialogue, and how to be a better listener, and certain things that you get from linguistics or linguistic studies, but just being more aware of how to have better conversations. That should be like an ongoing class or something, or maybe just through practice, like we're doing now. We're actually having an open dialogue here. This is dialogue. Dialogue is different than debate. Debate is like scoring points and who's the winner, and I think we're so used to that in our culture. That's how our politicians talk. That's how our media talks. It's like scoring points all the time. But dialogue is different. Dialogue is deeper. Dialogue is richer. Dialogue is transformative. But I think you mentioned, Jim, about the 60s. I was very young in the 60s. I actually have a photograph of myself at the age of 5 wearing beads. My parents put beads and a wig on me, and they dressed me up like a hippie. And that was in 1968, actually, which was one of the pivotal years. But I think a lot of those hopes and dreams resonate with me, to get back to that. Get back, like the Beatles said, get back. We need to get back to that somehow. But I think maybe there were certain elements in the culture that were threatened by that, and they wanted to put the kibosh on it. Maybe we're living in that backlash now,
Well, I think, too, when I'm thinking about our little dialogue right now, how many people actually will sit down for an hour during the course of a week and talk and discuss and negotiate and be willing to be open to hearing about new ideas? I think this is a phenomenon in itself. Wow. And we have to stop, and we have to take the time, and we have to realize how important, especially in our family life and with our relationships, to prioritize this kind of emotional communication, to exchange ideas. It's wonderful. I love doing this. Jim and I, fortunately, have an opportunity to do this on an ongoing and very regular basis because we spend a lot of time together. But this is something that for people who are watching the show, they need to take a pause and prioritize their relationships and this kind of open and honest dialogue and communication. It'll change your life.
Wow, this is incredible. Now, Beatty, you made me think of Socrates and Plato and the Greek philosophers, where they would walk around and just engage in the public sphere, the public space. So do this at home, folks, at your local cafes, with strangers, with friends, gather together and have these soirees, and we could come and film them maybe sometimes. But closing statements, closing thoughts, just now the educator in me coming out, let's be reflective on this process and what it's meant as we go forward.
I think it's been terrific. I want to continue this, and I want others to join us. I also want to mention, too, since you've brought up a few times the artistic examples in the apartment here, I want to. I think this is important for everyone listening to express oneself and to communicate in ways that sometimes are silent, and find your passion. Find your way of communicating. I know the paintings in this room largely are from my grandfather and my mother, and Beatty knew my grandparents, and she knew that they were Russian and very volatile and passionate people, but they were also very, in a sense, my grandfather expressed himself in a very silent way through his art and expressed his love. And what he always said to me was that he was in the process of creating beauty. And that's what it was about. And he tried to reach people and express himself in that way. And I think it's important for all of us to try to figure out ways that we can express ourselves in a way that's healthy, that's a way that's constructive, and that's beautiful. And let me just say this to my beautiful wife. I love you so much, and I want to continue dialogue with you as much as we can, and dialogue with in this show too as well.
I'm sure that there are not too many people and viewers who listen to this kind of love that is expressed in emotional communication. And of course, a priority really needs to be to have this and achieve this kind of closeness and dialogue within your own families and within your own relationships. But what I find when I walk the streets of New York, I want to engage, and I do engage with people on the streets and in stores, and it's so amazing to be able to see people who are so responsive to wanting to talk, to wanting to really have a human connection. So again, it's about reaching out, not only at home, which of course has got to be the number one priority, whether or not it's with your partner or your husband or your wife or your children, but just giving somebody a smile. And you'll see people maybe who are out there and who are wanting a quarter or $1 for some food or for a cup of coffee. And I find that giving that kind of attention to people who are less fortunate and that wonderful positive gesture, it gives to them, but it certainly makes me feel really wonderful and very humane.
Well, I feel so lucky to be in this dialogue with you both, with Jim Vrettos and Beatty Cohan and their lovely liberal Upper West Side apartment. I think we've begun something wonderful here on the Public Voice Salon. On behalf of my wonderful wife, Claudia, thank you all for watching us. Continue to watch us and do talk to people and try to bring this loving consciousness forward into the world. Thank you very much.